¡Ey, tú!
¿Quién? ¿Yo?
Sí, tú. Tú eres...
Yo soy Sofía.
Nos encontraremos con Sofía para palabrear y acercarnos al mundo de la filosofía.
Así.
Ajá.
Bueno, ¿y qué es Palabreando con Sofía?
Es un espacio de diálogo donde tendremos diversos invitados, historiadores, filósofos, sociólogos, antropólogos, entre otros profesionales de las ciencias humanas y sociales, para abordar un análisis crítico que permita comprender las realidades actuales, tomando como punto de partida las diferentes visiones filosóficas construidas a lo largo de la historia del pensamiento humano.
Pues bien, palabras, pensadores, documentos, reflexiones se dan cita aquí. Una producción de la Escuela de Ciencias Sociales, Artes y Humanidades. No te lo pierdas. Palabreando con Sofía.
Tudo pode acontecer.
Un cordial saludo a quienes nos sintonizan en el día de hoy. Esto es Palabreando con Sofía, espacio audiovisual auspiciado por el programa de Filosofía de la Escuela de Ciencias Sociales, Arte y Humanidades de la UNAD. En la dirección y conducción de este programa, quien les habla, Tayron Achury. Desde este espacio les damos un cordial saludo. En el día de hoy me acompañan Jonathan Delgado y Carlos Hernández a modo de coentrevistadores. Los dos son integrantes del semillero de investigación ETHOS, adscrito al grupo de investigación Cibercultura y Territorio. En esta emisión realizaremos una presentación sobre la idea de tecnología de Heidegger y su posible uso para la crítica contemporánea de la pornografía. Y para dar desarrollo a esta temática, en el día de hoy hemos invitado al profesor JUSTIN HARMON. JUSTIN es licenciado en Filosofía de la Universidad de Houston, máster en Filosofía de la Universidad de Houston y doctor en Filosofía de la Universidad de Kentucky. JUSTIN igualmente ha sido docente en esas mismas universidades. Actualmente se desempeña como docente en la Universidad de Oregon del Sur, en los Estados Unidos. El tema que nos convoca hoy es a propósito de un artículo que JUSTIN escribió en 2012 que se titula Vivir en la casa que construyó la pornografía, una crítica fenomenológica de la pornografía en la era de la tecnología del Internet. El artículo lo encuentran en Internet con el nombre de Living in the House That Built Pornography, a Phenomenological Criticism of Pornography in the Age of Internet Technology. Una interesante perspectiva que el doctor Harmon nos muestra como posibilidad en el uso metodológico más allá de los ámbitos propios de la metafísica heideggeriana. En este caso, para abordar un análisis de la pornografía y el Internet. Cordial greetings, Professor Harmon. In this broadcast of Palabreando con Sofía, participate Jonathan Delgado and Carlos Hernández, members of the ETHOS Research Group at UNAD, National Open and Distance University of Colombia. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
And now to get straight to the point, I would like to ask you. In your paper, you set out to make a phenomenological critique of pornography in the age of Internet technology. How does this approach articulate Heidegger's critique of technology? I would also like to ask whether it would not be necessary to speak of the same, insofar as the body and its use belong to the structure of human existence.
Well, Heidegger offers not a moral critique, but a metaphysical one. So the essence of technology, or technics, perhaps to be more accurate, is the way in which it holds sway historically over the totality of beings. That is, it's functioning as the metaphysics of modernity. So every epoch, every historical moment for Heidegger has its metaphysics, and this is what Ian Thompson calls the substructural scaffolding of historical intelligibility. So this decisive but kind of obscure ground or foundation for meaning determines the being of beings or the being of entities. And what this means is what things or entities in the broadest sense of these terms are, what a thing is. So whenever we say in defining or characterizing a given being in such a way that we say X is Y, we're giving expression to this universal sense according to which beings in general are understood. So we're dealing with an overarching univocal system of normative ordering that orders precisely how it is that we relate to beings, to others, even to our own selves as bodies. And the moment you encounter an entity, it is in this imperceptible flash revealed to you as something. And this as determines in advance how you relate to that something. So technology, as the metaphysics of our age, beginning roughly in the 17th century, is a mode of revealing in which every entity is represented in its being, in its isness, if you will, as bearing a univocally, so this very reductive way, a univocally measurable calculative value. So in this way, things lose their weight, their specificity, their singularity, becoming fungible or interchangeable. So in Heidegger's language, technology sets upon us and material nature, challenging nature to produce a kind of endless supply of resources to be stored up, transformed in an endless variety of ways. Now, in the domain of pornography, pornographically represented entities are revealed and ordered along according to a calculative value, but within a kind of libidinal or erotic economy, which shapes the subjectivity or inner life of porn consumers no less than it does the performers. So entities, namely women and others, are revealed and thus understood to be exchangeable, anonymous resources for a sexual desire that can never really be sated. And it's important to note that within the metaphysics of technology, everything is revealed in an ontologically deflated way. We're dealing really with the inauguration and sustaining in time of a world. And this is what Heidegger defines as an open relational context. So to use a different example, because of the presence and proliferation of, say, assault rifles in society, the world and its entities are permitted to show up in a particular way, namely as entities who can be shot. So guns are not these indifferent tools or instruments that can be freely deployed either for good or for ill, depending on, say, the values of the subject who uses them in this or that instance. Such values are in fact invisibly shaped by the revelatory world-opening power of guns. And so this tells us that the revelatory character of technology is really deeper than its more familiar instrumental function. And in this way, consumers of porn are quietly conditioned to relate to others in the world along the normative lines instigated by pornographic discourse, well beyond the confines of these media themselves. And to very quickly address the last part of that question, the body absolutely is a condition of Dasein, or of being there. And technology in general and pornography alter and undermine how we relate to our own bodies, almost as these weird instrumental things. And this adds to the perniciousness of the problem. And by the way, Heidegger is notoriously disengaged from questions of embodiment, and this is probably the weakest aspect of his philosophy.
Professor, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. I would like to ask you a question. In this framework, you use Heidegger's phenomenological theory and his hermeneutics. You propose that pornography would be a perversion which responds to technological discourse, in which human beings lose their humanity and are reduced to phantasmagoric beings. Are you referring to a digital age of the internet? Please explain to us that.
Well, as I put in the article, Pornography is authoritative in its invisible power to make the world so by describing it as already having been so. So speech, or logos in the Greek, calls forth entities and gathers them. And this is the verbal kind of active sense of legein related to logos, meaning really to speak or to think, but it's connected to ligament or ligature as that which brings together into a kind of coherence. And so there's this gathering together into the intelligible structures that we inhabit, that is, develop habits in and navigate. And so the porn consumer is made complicit in the ontological deflation or thinning out, a kind of excavation where the very space itself for hiddenness is purged or foreclosed. And so the open-endedness and illusory sense of freedom that seem to be brought about in the internet's pathways implicitly demand that the subject following the pathways fill in the dead ends of unfulfilled desire, these kind of unsatisfying waypoints of individual pornographic experiences, to fill these in with the substance of their own subjectivity. But this subjectivity, as I just suggested, is itself formed through the navigation itself as a kind of machinic desire without substance. Making it in this way an effect just as much as it's the cause. But this, to speak to this part of your question, we shouldn't understand it as a perversion. That's a kind of loaded moral concept. Because this, I think, would privilege some former mode of revealing or appropriation as better, truer, or more natural, thus introducing kind of unjustified moral hierarchy. And I'll also say that porn, it's not fair, I wouldn't say, to suggest that porn is responding to a technological discourse. Rather, it is technological discourse in its representation of bodies as targets for sexual desire, or targets of sexual desire. A representational schema that's always already accomplished in what Heidegger calls the event of appropriation, or the event of decision. And it's not the free subject making the decision. The decision there is the asubjective opening or dawning of sense that serves as a necessary condition for the possibility of the so-called free subject deciding anything at all. Hence, one might argue that pornographic discourse is technological discourse and vice versa, insofar as porn enframes whatever enters into its orbit according to a calculative instrumental logic. And this is something you might refer to as pornologistics. And to talk about the way in which digital pornography is distinguished from, as I say, its analog precursors, the internet is almost paradigmatic of the way technology functions in Heidegger's critique. In its ever-expanding referential totality, the internet shrinks all spatial and temporal distance, circulating its objects for immediate consumption, ultimately reducing the content to so much data. So it's not simply a matter of transferring the content of older analog media, these pornographic materials, to the form of the digital sphere. As Marshall McLuhan put it, the medium is the message. Form and content can't be clearly distinguished.
Dr. Harmon, it's truly remarkable to be with us today in this meeting. I would like to congratulate you on your article. Could you expand a little on the idea that global technology supplants global mythology?
Well, to be more accurate, I might have instead said that modern global technology has become our now limitlessly globalized or totalized mythos. We even have our own mythical heroes, sometimes ambivalently villains of the tech age. Think Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, etc. For the ancients, the pre-philosophical Homeric Greeks, for example, myth was not myth. It remained the unseen background that withdraws behind the very objects that come to presence in it, like the air that we breathe and move through, or the water that fish swim through. It's transparent. So mythology is the archaic in the sense, the Greek sense of origin, ongoing source, beginning. It's the archaic logos or gathering of sense performed by the stories in which a people finds itself reflected back and is also given direction for the future. So think tradition, progress. Where do we come from? Where are we going? Technology or technologos, it's now the fertile contexture in which we recognize ourselves and continuously articulate new accounts of what's possible. Now, it's kind of a silly example, but consider the popular TV show Ancient Aliens, the basic premise of which and of so-called ancient alien theory is that the content of ancient myths behind every past culture and civilization is really a demonstration of formative technological power. The earliest thinkers in our modern intellectual tradition, Galileo, Francis Bacon, Descartes, they don't just theorize science, this nominally value-neutral, purely descriptive enterprise, but rather technoscience, a system of practical relations aimed at expanding, really without limit, human power and control over nature and its processes. But the story of science's purported objectivity and value neutrality is itself a part of myth-making. Rationality, logos, supposedly, the story goes, replaced mythos, making way for science. But the purported demythification of reality is really just another mythification, and it hides itself as such in the same way that pre-philosophical or pre-scientific myth did.
A very interesting point in your test is where you say that it's not that pornography transforms women into objects, but that pornography as a technological discourse reduces objects, women, to ephemeral spectre. Could you explain this point, Dr. Harmon?
Well, in the metaphysical approach I sketch in the paper, which in some ways I've since revised, every entity, insofar as it is real, is an object. And what it means to be an object, drawing from the etymology of the term, is to stand over and against other objects from which it can then be distinguished and to which it also stands in a relation. Objects impose themselves on me, for better or for worse, happily or unhappily, in ways that I can't simply choose to amend. Objects condition me. Now, in a related important sense, objects object to my subjective preferences and any conditionless value that I happen to impute to them. Now, the problem with value-based discourse, the kind of techno-discourse of modernity, as Heidegger elaborates in his 1947 work, The Letter on Humanism, the problem is that it always lowers the being of the valued entities to the terms of the one who values, that is the subject. So value presupposes valuation, which presupposes a valuator. And the opposite of an object, I suggest, is a specter, a being who is present precisely in its absence, a being who is there and not being there, a kind of featureless ghost posing as an abstract, empty placeholder waiting to be filled by a free subject filled with meaning or sense. A free subject who alone, according to a distinction introduced by Kant, has absolute unconditioned worth. Pornography, I argue, transforms the entities, typically women, that enter into its matrix into these specters, figures without history, without depth, substance, without self-standing independence, thereby de-objectifying them in the sense I just articulated of what it means to be an object. In other words, making them unreal. So I think we can understand spectralization as a process as the one opposite to the more familiar reification, or turning something which is purely relational into something substantial, self-standing and real.
Insofar as we understand pornography as a discourse capable of defending itself, I would like to ask you, what is it about the discourse that makes it possible for it to be freely available, for it to be used at all costs despite its power to harm? What would be your answer to this question?
Well, this is an interesting question. I think it gets at a powerful reason to resist the solution of censorship. Let me just say, following Heidegger's invocation of Hölderlin, that where the danger lies, so one finds the saving power. And the impetus to censor or shut down this kind of speech, I think, would be a manifestation of the very technological discourse under question. A different but parallel channel through which the reductive will to will finds expression. And I think we have to be careful. Just like the Greek concept of pharmakon, which is at once poison and cure, any logos or gathering of sense cannot simply be demonized or valorized.
You say that the speech in this pornography display is powerful enough to affect the very fact of rape in this street. But yet, in your article, it seems that discourse is not determined. Can you elaborate on this idea?
Well, to be clear, the claim that pornographic speech is powerful enough to affect or bring about rape in the streets, well, that was made by Judge Easterbrook in the 1985 case, American Booksellers versus Hudnut. Now, I discussed this landmark case in the paper in order to tease out what I find to be a curious tension. So Easterbrook arrives at the judgment that pornography is protected speech precisely because it is so powerful and dangerous. Now, I think there's something undeniably strange about this. And he's able to justify what appears to be irrational in virtue of a concealed metaphysical assumption, namely that the potency of such speech is predicated on the free interpretive power of individual subjects, these free-floating bubbles of consciousness that are somehow insulated from influence by the very world that they would determine interpretively. Yet this is precisely the arguably Cartesian assumption of an unconditioned, trans-historical, value-giving subject, impervious to the normative ordering of the world, that Heidegger's critique and so-called destruction of the history of Western metaphysics rejects.
Specifically, Dr. Harmon, and very briefly, why do you say that pornography discourse is technological from the perspective of Heidegger's discourse on technology?
Well, given that porn of the relevant, ever more extreme modern variety presents itself within the ubiquitous metaphysical enframing of modern technology, it can't help but be technological. So technology understood in this way reduces beings in the world to fungible units in an endless economy of exchange. So porn, deriving etymologically from the Greek porne, originally meaning what is bought and purchased, probably in reference to prostitutes. And this grew from the verb pernanai, to sell. So in our pornified world, everything has its price.
Would you say that your perspective of Heidegger's discourse on technology is a discourse where the instrumentalization of the human being is evident, that it is most evident specifically in relation to the internet?
Yes, that's a fair assessment, especially given the internet's normative logic of favoring and circulating widely through these asubjective algorithms the most extreme content and human tendencies, and also of promoting superficial categories into which to locate ourselves, all driven by data markets and the proliferation of human capital.
Well, to finish, one last question, Professor Harmon. In your paper, you ask, what is wrong with being an object? In the same vein, what is wrong with being a specter or being or not being a fantasy?
Again, I'm not so interested in moralizing. I asked that question in the article for largely polemical reasons, but I will say specters are not real. And if we frame those with whom we would establish relations, even our own selves, as unreal in advance of encountering them, then our relationships are not really relationships at all. They become abstract units in the groundless and ultimately endless struggle for greater power and control, a struggle which has no real subject at its center. It's not we who freely use or deploy technology. Rather, technology takes us into its fold, whether we embrace it or strive to repudiate it.
Very well, with that last reflection, we end this interview. Of course, we hope to have the opportunity to invite you back to this program of reflection on the social science and philosophy. Thank you very much, Professor Harmon, for sharing this interesting talk about some of your philosophic work.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure speaking with you.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Harmon. Desde la interpretación del Dr. Harmon, Heidegger ofrece no una crítica moral, sino una metafísica. Para Heidegger, la esencia de la técnica y de la tecnología sería más bien una forma que se impone históricamente sobre la totalidad de los seres. Y específicamente se impone en el ámbito del cómo nos relacionamos con los otros seres y con nuestro propio ser, en tanto que cuerpos. Pero también es ese ámbito donde la tecnología se impone a nosotros y a la naturaleza material. Y sería desde su carácter de función instrumental que la tecnología se inserta, en este caso, en la mentalidad de los consumidores de porno y mediante la manipulación prioritariamente del ser de la mujer, en una tarea silenciosa de condicionamiento en el ejercicio de relacionarse con otros, instigados por el discurso pornográfico. La pornografía es autoritaria en su poder invisible de hacer que el mundo sea así al describirlo como si ya fuera así, es decir, al describirlo como si forzosamente tuviese que ser de esa manera. Y como si absolutamente fuera de esa manera. Entre otras cosas, proponiendo una supuesta apertura total que en realidad es ilusoria. Y es esa sensación de libertad ilusoria del Internet que en cierta forma completaría deseos insatisfechos de formas ilusorias con supuestas personas que no son personas y ni siquiera objetos, sino alucinaciones fantasmagóricas opuestas a las potencialidades reales del ser. Y con esto último llegamos al final de esta emisión. Agradecemos a la Vicerrectoría de Medios y Mediaciones que hizo posible la realización de este espacio. Agradecemos nuevamente al Dr. Justin Harmon por haber aceptado nuestra invitación. En esta ocasión los acompañó Jonathan Delgado y Carlos Hernández, miembros del semillero ETHOS del programa de Filosofía de la UNAD, y Tayron Achury, docente de la Escuela de Ciencias Sociales, Arte y Humanidades. Hasta una próxima oportunidad.
La tarea que enfrenta el pensamiento hoy día de algún modo no tiene precedentes y exige una forma totalmente nueva de pensar. Martin Heidegger.
Esto es Palabreando con Sofía.